Good afternoon. This is Lee McWhorter. Welcome to the first session of the new Introduction to Security Foundations course that began here just yesterday. I'm the instructor at the WashU Cybersecurity program and will be acting as your mentor as well. We have a fairly small program, so I'm carrying both roles until we get a little bigger and maybe get a graduate or two from our program we can bring on as mentors. Anyway, what we do in these video lectures is they kind of vary by the class. This class is an introductory class, and so we'll cover the material more lecture style. But as the courses go on in the program, we'll do a mix of lectures and workshops and demos and various things. And of course, if you actually manage to attend one of the sessions, we can answer questions and do like any other real class. Otherwise, they'll of course be posted into the class announcement section after the time. When I get through all the sections for a day, I put them all together, download them all, put them all back up on YouTube, put up the links, and get everything all updated. So you get an idea of what's going on. Most classes in our program are basically broken into 10 lessons. So you pretty much have to kind of keep going at about a lesson a day. The due dates and everything are in the announcement. This class is definitely one of those. There are a couple exceptions that you'll see later in the program when we get to like web security, web application security, and project management. It's broken up a little differently, but the vast majority of our courses are just 10 lessons. So one lesson per day, basically over our 2-week periods until we get to the final project. And so what I do in these lectures is I try to supplement and complement the materials. Hit the high points, highlight the main things, and then like I said, when we get into other classes, next class, Network Foundations, and then pretty much on from there, we'll usually have some demos, workshop aspects to the lecture videos as well. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of go through fairly quickly the first 5 lessons, and they are, one of the things I always tell students is that all of these lessons throughout this class, this is very much a conceptual class, a foundational class, but the thing is that's important is these concepts come back again and again. Not only would they come back when you finish the program and take the Security Plus exam, for example, there'll be questions from this lesson and all of them on that test. But in addition, these concepts, are just sort of the base concepts that you'll use throughout your career as a cybersecurity professional. You'll have to keep in mind these kinds of thoughts and the various things we're going to talk about over the next 2 weeks. So without any further ado, that's enough administrivia up front. We have 5 lessons to cover. They are Introduction to Cybersecurity Foundations, Security Roles, Attacks and Threat Actors, Information Security, and then Defense Basics. In the first lesson, pretty much we start off by defining what security is. And I think we'll go all the way back to the Latin, and I'll leave you to read all that stuff. But basically, of course, what we're really trying to get at is what is cybersecurity? What is information security? What is it that we're doing? And basically, the way I always like to define it is the practice of cybersecurity is the goal and the act of trying to protect all of an organization's informational proprietary information, confidential information, basically in the broadest sense, just information, as well as the information assets that we obviously use to access that information. Information in the form of zeros and ones by itself is kind of useless to us humans. So we use a lot of different things like computers and servers and of course the networking and all those aspects that help transfer that information around, process that information around, display that information for us. And so our job is to protect the information at its core, but we have to protect the various assets that help us process that information, use that information, store that information, etc. And so that's the informational assets part. There's a whole series of key terms in there. Won't just try not to, I don't in these lectures just read to you from the lesson or, say exactly the same things most of the time. So because it's meant to supplement it. So the key terms are pretty straightforward in that first lesson. So I'll let you read those for yourselves. But there are a couple concepts that are important to think about. And one of the first ones that I do like to talk about because it's so important, and you'll see it basically like a lot of these again and again, is the concept of the CIA triad. and we're not talking about our Central Intelligence Agency here. We're talking about basically what I like to think of it as, these are the promises we make to our organization within cybersecurity. We are wanting to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the data under our protection. And so what does all that mean? Well, confidentiality is pretty straightforward, right? Almost everybody in every organization has something they want to keep secret. And so, of course, that's a big part of what we do in cybersecurity, is keep stuff secret. We keep the outsiders from getting in, right? We keep people even within the organization from getting to stuff that they're not supposed to. And so, that's a pretty straightforward one, and most people can grasp that concept, and even coming into the program with hardly any experience, understand the idea of, oh yeah, we're going to make that read-only, and we're going to protect that. We're going to have access rights, and we're going to talk about all that stuff over the course of the program. Then the integrity part, well, what's that about? Well, we want to maintain the data and maintain its integrity, in the sense that we want it to be what it's supposed to be. Now, that doesn't mean we're protecting the data from change. Change is an important part of, if you're running an accounting system, you obviously want to be able to put in entries that you've received money, and you want to be able to pay your bills, and put in entries to say that you paid those bills. So data is going to change, but as long as it changes within an authorized and secure mechanism, then we're cool with that. But of course, if it starts changing because somebody's hacked in and changing that data, then that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to protect the integrity of the data. And even that one, for the most part, makes sense to people when it comes to what we do in cybersecurity. If you were to even pick people off the streets, they would probably get to the concept, if they didn't use that phrase, that cybersecurity people are trying to protect that information, keep it secret, keep it secure, keep it standard, keep it known, and protect that integrity. The problem, the third piece, though, is the one that I find that sometimes students and people in the field sometimes make less important, because they're so focused on protecting at the battlements and protecting against the outsiders and keeping everything super secret and safe, that we sometimes overdo what we do in security, and we end up jeopardizing the third promise. And the third promise is availability. It's a big part of what we do. If you get down to it, we don't do cybersecurity in a vacuum. We do it in the context of the organization we work for. And in the same sense that IT is not just done for IT's sake, security is not done for security's sake. We're there to empower our organization to succeed. If we don't, then there won't be any budgets for IT and security. There won't be any budgets probably for us. And, if the organization ultimately, goes under because it can't get its job done, because we've done too much or made it too difficult, and then we're not providing the availability piece. Or something does happen and we haven't planned for that recovery. And that's something we will talk about as well. And it's something that sometimes, like I said, people focus less on. They get caught up in defending against the attackers, defending the battlements from the siege, and then we get caught up in securing things. I always joke sometimes that security people, if we had our choice, from a security point of view, that those first couple, the confidentiality, integrity, that we would want to have just the most secure policies and procedures in place. We might have to, users might have to have a 256 character password that changed all the time. And yeah, that would be super secure, at least on the surface. But as we're going to learn throughout the program, and from right now, from this lecture, it actually would, of course, start to jeopardize things in a couple different ways. One is that usually when things get so complex, as we'll talk about later in the program, then people cheat. They design a system, later in this course, I should say, but what they did, they'll put their post-it note up on their monitor with their password. And now, even though you have these really, really long passwords, everybody in the company's got them in their front drawer or stuck to their monitor. So not quite as secure as you would hope. But the other part of it is that, if we do those things, if we chose those options every time, the most secure, the hardest, then of course we could jeopardize the organization itself. I mean, if nobody can log in, or if everybody's having to take, 20 minutes in the morning to, go through some process and generate a new super huge password, and then finally log in, then we're slowly but surely impacting the vulnerability, the company's productivity. And like I said, our job is to make the data available to the people who need it. And as we're going to talk about, there's, some guidelines in that, and then ultimately technology and policies that'll help us control that. But once again, we have to maintain all three of these promises: the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability. We have to have salespeople have access to the sales data, accounting people have to have access to the accounting data, and on down the line, whatever our organization is, whether we're a governmental agency, a nonprofit, or a corporation trying to make money, if we don't help our organization succeed, then ultimately we will be out of a job ourselves. And like I said, we have to not only defend and prepare for all that, defend and set up all of our defenses and put our policies and security policies in place, but we have to plan for that bad situation. We have to plan for what if something does happen, not only if somebody breaches, but as we'll learn next week even, what if something happens in like a natural disaster? It's how do we maintain that promise of availability? One of the things that, even that little example of the harder password policy brings out, and it's one of the last important concepts from the first lesson, is the concept that there is a inverse relationship between security and convenience. So, the more you make something secure, the higher it goes up, then the less convenient it is to do. And you can take a simple example of, if you were to put gazillions of locks on your door in principle, that might make it more secure, but it would take you have to carry around a whole thing of keys, have to unlock all these doors before you can get in, lock all these doors before you go to bed, unlock all the doors before you leave next morning. You see my point. So there is definitely this inverse relationship between security and convenience, and it's one of the things that is what makes that balancing that triad effectively for us a little difficult. Because like I said, on one hand, we might want to err toward the most secure possible choices, but we have to balance that with the need to provide and actually provide these resources to the users within the organization to get their jobs done. So there's always this trade-off, and one of the big things you're going to learn throughout this program, you're going to learn all kinds of things. You're going to learn how to set up firewalls, you're going to learn how to attack systems, you're going to learn how to scan and defend systems, you're going to learn how to set up policies and get a nice broad overview of this whole field, and even related and I think beneficial subtopics like needing to know a little bit about scripting and programming, needing to know about project management and other aspects. And so you'll have this well-rounded thing, but this is going to be the challenge in a sense of any place you go to work, anytime you go do something, when you're setting up a new policy, when you're setting up new access controls, when you're setting up rights and permissions to secure things, you have to balance that with the need to get things done, right? And so each organization, as we're going to find out in this course and throughout the program, will end up having to do its own assessments and make its own decisions based on a series of concepts and principles we'll talk about actually more next week. The last thing that the lesson ends up with, lesson 1, is just sort of paints the picture of why this is such a exciting in some ways and challenging field, and why there's so much growth and interest in cybersecurity, and to be honest, why we see so many breaches on the news. And that's because the world is just exploding. And when I first got into this years and years ago, there were only so many of us on the internet, through usually research institutions, schools, early dial-up services, various things like that. And there weren't many of us, and the vast majority of people didn't know what the internet was at all. And it wasn't until, say, the 90s, after the graphical browsers like, first Mosaic, but then Netscape and IE came out, Internet Explorer, that people really got onto the web. And the web is what really most people actually use, and for the most part, and think of. If you asked the average person off the street what the internet was, they would define the web more than they would define the underlying internet architecture. The internet's been here for a long time, but as more and more people have gotten on it, more and more devices have been getting on it, more and more servers, more and more systems, more and more countries. We've gone from literally tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who had access in the earliest days of the mainstream internet, to millions, tens of millions, billions of people who have internet access. And of course, then the countless devices, countless servers, and with the growth of things like the cloud and what we call the Internet of Things, which is we'll talk more about in this program, there are just all these opportunities. So many targets that can be attacked if you're an attacker. We have to defend all these targets, and we have to be aware that all these sources, it's one of the big things that's happened is that with all these devices, hackers will attack a lot of devices, build a bunch of them together in kind of a network, and then use them to further their means, whether that's to attack somebody else or send out spam or send out attacks. And so we see it's just an exponentially growing thing. And so this field and the importance of it is growing right along with it. And as you'll see, we'll see many, many examples throughout the course and in the program. So then the next lesson, lesson 2, is a fairly quick one, at least from the point of view of how much I'm going to lecture on it. It's on security roles. And we decided to put this here for 2 reasons. One is that it starts with some what we call conceptual roles. These are roles that are kind of categories, in a sense, of people that within an organization. Are they just users of the system? Really, the vast majority of people within an organization, even senior people, would be considered users in a generic sense from a security point of view. But then there are people who are administrators, custodians, and owners of data, and these different roles or conceptual roles that are important to understand mainly because, as you'll see next week when we talk about some of the various policies and things that we have to put in place and some of the guidelines we have to follow that are out there and that we would follow to do so, many times these roles may be referenced. And so if you're reading some guideline, it's important to understand the terminology. But the other part of this lesson is really an overview of the field. It talks about some different sample entry-level roles in cybersecurity, which are the types of roles that we've thought of in preparing this program, and that we talk to employers about what we would need to cover to put a program together where they would feel that somebody coming out of it would know what they needed to take on these roles. So that's sort of where we're headed with this program. But of course, early on here, as you first get in, some of you may have a full idea of where you want to be and who you want to do and what you want to do as you go forward. I'm much older than probably most of I know of the current students, except for you folks that are now new in this section that I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet. But I assume I probably am again. And I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up in a way. So, it's good to get an idea and see the options. And so one of the parts of this lesson is to give you an idea of where things could go from here. You get out of this program, you get something along the lines of one of those entry-level jobs, and then you can see there are different pathways, different places you could go heading into the intermediate and ultimately on into the more advanced roles, ultimately becoming a very specialized expert pen tester, a very sought after role, working either for an organization or independently, or working for an independent company that does that third party for other companies. You could be a chief security officer, so you could be a manager of a security team, all kinds of things that over time, you might have to decide to supplement your skills from our program with additional learning, additional certifications. Especially if you're interested in that management side, you might need to take some leadership management or even an MBA someday as you further your career and head for that kind of a role. But those are, what that chapter is about, is to give you an idea of those conceptual roles that occasionally we'll see those terms being used, especially in some of the standards guides and guidelines. But then the other is to give you a little idea of what's going on in our field and all the various possibilities and options that await you after finishing our program and getting into the field. That's about all I have on 2, because it's pretty straightforward. You do a little research and think about where you might want to go and do some research on some of the fields. And one of the things that I've mentioned to students before, and now that we have some that are in our final project, I'll actually get to do this here in the coming weeks and months ahead as more and more get there. And we have a few more fairly high in the program as well. The idea of, okay, what did you do back in Security Foundations? What did you think you wanted to do? And now that you've completed the program, it's something and I would ask you to put, after doing the lesson 2 exercises and thinking about right now what you think you want to do and where you want to go after you take the program, did that change? Did you decide once the program was, you got your hands on certain things that you really wanted to go one way versus another? And so that's one of the things that I think will be interesting to chat with you about over the coming weeks ahead as we go through the program together. Then lesson 3 is about sort of at least a big part of the meat of why we do this. If if there weren't attacks and threat actors out there, we wouldn't have to secure things per se, or at least as much. We would probably still have some reasons to secure things, from snooping eyes and busybody and fellow employees that aren't supposed to be in certain things. But a big part of what drives people and the excitement and the headlines and some of the tools and technologies are kind of driven by this cat and mouse game we play with the attackers out there. So this lesson begins to introduce us to some of those attackers. And we talk, pretty high level about things like script kiddies, which is sort of the way the industry considers the amateurs in our field. Or I shouldn't say in our field, per se, they're not in our field yet, but they may end up being in it or being who we fight against, depending on which way they go. I always joke that every year around Christmas time, a new crop of script kiddies is born, because around the world people get new computers, and while most kids run off to play video games or jump on the social media to chat with their friends, there's a certain subset, every time, a certain percentage of them who will immediately head out and download various tools, many of which you're going to get exposed to in this program, and they will start attacking. They will start attacking their friends' Minecraft servers, or they'll attack their home computer so they can knock them off Fortnite. Whatever it is that they start off doing, they'll start poking around places. Many of them will get in trouble and get caught. Some won't. Some who do will move on still in the field. But at some point, one of two things will happen, usually. Folks that are into that will either end up heading the way you folks are, and that we have heading down the road of being the good guys, the white hats, hackers that defend and try to make security better, or they will continue down that nefarious road and ultimately become criminal hackers of some form or fashion. Because while many years ago when I started out, some of the earliest hacking that was done almost innocently, and honestly, in some cases, people exploring around on systems that were out there and seeing what they could do. They were done for a little bit of fame, if you will, of bragging rights that you had been able to get into this system and break the code, so to speak. But today, while some of the folks just starting out may innocently still be in that category, the vast majority of people that are in the hacking space on the black hat side, the bad guys, if you will, are in it for money. And so, we have all different levels, and that's a really broad category. All of these are actually, but they're just, sort of chunks we can put people into. So start off with a script kiddie. Very likely, if you continue to be the bad guy, of course, you move into some form of a criminal hacker. And then as you continue to move up, we find more experienced, well-funded, potentially criminal hacking gangs. And that's become actually a reality in our world, where there are different places in the world and different groups in the world that have, really put together elaborate networks of professionals in their own, and they are in their own way. They're building malware, they're building networks of machines that can attack other machines, they can ransom, all these kind of things you've read about. And so then, of course, a certain crop of our enemy moves up beyond that to ultimately what we call APT, or advanced persistent threats, which are like the nation state players. Your politics aside, and whatever country aside, the reality is that most countries on the planet have some kind of cyber force. Usually, many of them, sometimes loosely affiliated with the government, sometimes directly employed by the government in question. And they are all different kinds, from classic spies trying to gain information on the foreign governments for diplomatic reasons, to industrial espionage to be able to still state secrets so that a country could give them to their manufacturers and try to grow, to just all kinds of myriads of reasons. And so it's important to understand the threat actors and then the various types of attacks. Attacks have been going on since pretty much the first person put a computer up, the first people put computers up on the internet, and arguably attacks and even hacking in a sense has been going on before that. You could argue that lockpicking, code cracking, and various other activities that have gone on much longer in history than computing were kind of predate the game of where we are today, of being the hackers, the white hats versus the black hats. And they come up with new tools and new attacks and methods, and we come up with new ways to defend and counter those. And but I like to group, and the lesson does as well, attacks into kind of standard attacks, things that have been going on a long time, just being able to attempt to log into somebody else. That's an attack. Whether you sit down at that PC and keep trying to, like you see in the movie sometime, guess their password because you know something about them and figure it's probably their pet's name or something like that, which is still sadly true to this day. Or of course you use tools that automate that attack. These kinds of just trying to gain access to systems, to gain access to parts of it that you're not supposed to, say an open web server that has secure parts, then people try to get into those. That's been going on and continues to go on. But we also have a whole new breed of attacks, or many times standard attacks have morphed into these newer versions. So for example, the idea of what's called denial of service type attack, where you basically, an attacker would just overwhelm a system, a target system, with so many requests of one form or another that the system basically bogs down, can't deal with it, and thus we've denied that service. So, if I was to just send enough internet traffic to your IP, where you are on your end of watching this video, I could knock you off the internet. Or at least make it so that when you surfed things, it was like, wow, man, my internet's terrible today. It's taking me 5 minutes to pull up one web page. Why is that? Well, unbeknownst to you, some evil hacker could just be flooding your interface with, ping requests, something as simple as a ping, and just that response back, and even if it's ignoring it and not responding, all of the requests are coming in. They're opening ports on that machine, and even though they're being reset, if I can send you enough of them, right, then I can overwhelm your system and either take you offline or drastically impact your performance. And we could do this years and years ago in the earliest days of the internet. And usually in the earliest days, it kind of came down to who had more bandwidth. If you were on dial-up and I had a better connection, like a T1 line or something, then you were going to lose every time. But today, of course, many people have better bandwidth than we did back then. And so, you then combine that into the tricks I'm talking about. I've already mentioned that hackers will go out there and take advantage of people who don't have good security principles and policies in place, or just leave things at the default, so to speak, and they'll take over thousands, maybe millions of devices and machines. And then once they have that network built, they will turn that network on somebody. And now we're talking about a distributed denial of service attack. So it's not just one person trying to flood the other off. It's now thousands of machines. And so I don't care how much bandwidth you have, if enough, of these kind of attacks come targeting at your systems, your company, your organization, your website, you are likely to go down. There are ways to defend against that, but it's one of the worst attacks when it comes to what can you do. Information's coming from everywhere. You might have to go to your ISP and change your addresses and change your routing so that you can get your stuff and get your website back up and running again. So there are, of course, all kinds of newer attacks because we didn't even have those things before. I'm constantly trying to find new stories of these things to add to my repertoire to talk about. One of the most recent that I found, and we'll probably mention it again, so if you hear it again, I apologize, but it was a fascinating story of a casino in Southeast Asia, probably Macau, given the location of a lot of casinos there, like the Vegas of that area. But anyway, wherever it wasn't mentioned, they weren't named directly. But the story was about how they were hacked and very valuable information was stolen from them, including their list of high rollers. And it was done through their aquarium. And of course, when I tell people this story, they kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? Through their aquarium? Well, in this day and age, we're seeing an explosion of items now getting hooked up to the internet and being given processing power. And so, of course, they had not just a small aquarium like a fishbowl. They had a big aquarium in their casino. It was part of their entry in their lobby. And it was a saltwater aquarium, pretty fancy thing. And so they had hired a third-party company to manage that. That company had come in and installed a very smart system that was in the water, and it could monitor the salinity and the temperature and everything else. And it was connected to the internet so that it could send those people warnings if anything was out of whack with that aquarium, and they could come run down there, they want to lose all the fish, and it's a very expensive operation. And so I don't know, probably automatically fed them and everything else. I don't know all it did, but that's what this device was doing in the aquarium. That's what its purpose was. But for various reasons, including likely the leaving of default passwords and just vulnerabilities that many of these manufacturers now that are starting to add this tech to their products. Think about somebody who built something to automate and take care of a fish tank. They're not maybe a tech company, and that, they may have a little bit of smarts in there, some mechanical pumps, and they make equipment that works with fish tanks. But now they want to make it smart, so they throw a little bit of computing power in there, throw a Wi-Fi chip in there, and boom, now we got a smart fish tank aquarium monitoring system. But have they thought about security? Have they built the most secure software? Are they just using off-the-shelf tools and not securing things? And so a hacker finds this, is able to break in, and now this is inside physically, inside their firewall, inside the network. And then from this little device, they were able to probe around, attack another machine inside of that network, and ultimately acquire the data they were after. So there are all kinds of different threat actors out there, different categories and classifications, and they run a spectrum from the most inexperienced, just got a computer and started to hack, to people that have been doing this as long as I have on the bad side or longer. And then, of course, there are various people who focus. And, of course, some of those very, very focused people, whether they've been doing it forever or been doing it for only a few years, but they're just obsessed with this, are some of the best out there, right? And they're the ones that keep me awake at night. I don't want them targeting me. And, I want to keep those types of things in mind when I plan security policy for myself or companies that I do work for. And so in lesson 3, we talk about information security, which starts to put it a little bit in the context of a company, and we'll talk more about that in lessons next week as well. But in information security, as I said, ultimately in a cybersecurity, we're trying to protect the informational assets. So not surprising, we have a category or a subfield or sub-piece of this called information security. We're trying to protect that information. That's our core job. And so when we look at this area, one of the keywords you're going to see a lot is a control. In cybersecurity, when we talk about putting a control in place, we're talking about anything we do to protect the data. So if we put in a firewall, that's a control. We're limiting access to our network. If we put a password policy in place, that's a control. We're trying to put some kind of control and a limit on how people access the network, and thus that we can maintain some degree of security. Of course, one of the things that there's a nice chart in there that I'll mention, or I shouldn't say chart, it's an image, and it shows sort of this onion model, this layered model. And we're going to see this again and this type of concept again. But at the middle, it shows the information, and then it talks about having products, people, and procedures layered on top of that as the additional layers of that onion that we use to protect that information. So if you think about it, it kind of starts to make sense. If the information, let's put it in your own personal context at home. You don't want your personal information stolen. You don't want somebody into your computer stealing your contact list, your credit cards, your account passwords, your tax files, TurboTax, whatever you might use, tax code. You don't want that, right? You don't want them getting into your web browser cache and having everything, knowing everything about you. So that information is sitting there basically on a computer, which actually itself, it has some form of a software-based firewall protecting it. But of course, it's then on a network usually, right, connected to Wi-Fi or some way to the router that you have from your ISP. And that is a device. It's also trying to protect you. It's another product, right? And so it has certain things like the ability to block incoming traffic unless it's been requested from the inside. So you can surf out and get an answer, but somebody can't just come in and hit your machine. So right there, we have software and hardware just on your machine that are basically set up to be controls. They're part of products that are, and of course, then you're the user. So ideally, if you do the right thing, you don't turn off your firewall, right? So that you have that protection. But of course, in a company setting, we go further. We have the procedures to go with it. Now, even you as an individual should have your own procedure, like good password policy, whether you're using a password manager or using really solid passwords that that are complicated, but yet you can still remember. You should have certain things like, sort of common sense and smarts, and hopefully by the end of this program, you'll be beyond that even, of course, but that you have your own security policy. Not to go to certain sites, not to do certain things. Well, in an organizational setting, we have to protect that organization. So we protect that information by putting these products in place that are going to protect. Then people are going to use those products, and what these procedures and policies and guidelines that we're going to learn about do is guide those people to use those products to protect the data. So a password policy is just guiding the average user in a company to at least have a halfway decent password so we can try to protect our data. Configuration guideline for a firewall wouldn't be for every user in the company, but it would be for system administrators and network administrators to know how to set up a firewall or a new firewall or replacement firewall within our organization. And, having decisions about what kind of antivirus we use and what kinds of rights and permissions we use is going to all be documented and be part of our security policy. And these are ultimately the controls that we use: people, products, and procedures to protect that information we're trying to protect. Now, there's another important concept in 4 as well, and that one is the concept of the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. As people start to get into this and realize what our job is, then sometimes we get this, wow, how do we do this? I mean, the IT is huge in some companies, right? And the bigger company, the bigger, more IT you got. So how do we protect all that? And where do we start? And all these things. Well, this model is one of the things that helps us. We can break up a typical organization, at least conceptually, into multiple domains. And group things together within those domains by the area they cover. And what this does is give us a conceptual model to look at and to plan policy for. So, for example, in the 7 domains of an IT or infrastructure, we have things like the workstation domain, the user domain, the LAN domain, the WAN domain, the remote access domain. So there's 7 of them. There's the system domain, etc. And so why do we break it up? Well, because there's common things we may need to do in each of those areas. So, for example, in the user domain, we're talking about the users, the people who use these various devices, computers, and terminals all throughout our organization to get the jobs done. So we're going to need policies like password policy, acceptable use policy. We're going to need, various other things, training and awareness programs to help those people so they can do their job, but yet do it in a secure way. When we get to the workstation level, that used to just be PCs, but today it can be, rugged devices, terminals, point of sale systems, PCs, tablets, phones, everything, all those devices, the things that users use to connect in and get access to stuff, right? So we have to secure those devices. Think about antivirus, think about other kinds of policies and settings, rights and permissions that'll be unique to those. And then, of course, as you move to the network, we have different things we have to deal with. We have to secure our routers, our switches. We have to be able to understand how that the network design can affect security, and who we want to give access to which resources on the network. When we get to the WAN, that's where people really think the wide area network, our connection to the outside world effectively. But in many organizations, the WAN also includes the connections to other offices, say around the country or around the world, in addition to connecting to the outside world. And of course, but these big connections is what most people think of: the hackers coming in, hacking into the through the firewall and getting into your stuff. Well, that's definitely can happen at that domain. So we obviously want things like firewalls and security intrusion detection. And so you can see we can divide the network, the whole organization, the IT structure, into these different areas. And then we can look at things that we need to do. And it allows us to then, not have to, it's like they always, whatever, a long, trip of 1,000 miles still begins with about the first step, right? So the same deal, we're going to have to secure it all, but we can chunk it up, break it into steps. So it's an important concept, and one you will likely see both in the field and of course later in the coursework. And then lesson 5, as we wrap up this first video lecture for this class, is on defense basics, and it will pick up next week with some additional defense concepts. And all of these are, as I said, like a lot of the stuff in these first class, that's going to come back again and again. You're going to hear about CIA again. You're going to hear about 7 domains again. You're going to have questions on test about it. You'll use it and you really should start putting this stuff in your mind over the coming weeks ahead and make it part of who you are and how you look at things. And so these next couple lessons are real critical in that area. And the first one we talk about is what we call layered defenses or security in depth. This concept comes from the military. If you've ever been to a military base or studied any kind of battle or things like that, you can start to see those. I always use the analogy of a castle, though, because I think it is the absolute typical best example of layered defenses that exist that most people can relate to, no matter what their interest in military or history, etc., because they've seen one on TV or get the concept. And if you think about a castle, you think about that it actually, before you even get to it, it already usually has its first line of defense out. And you may not have even been aware of what it was from that castle's point of view. But it's not uncommon to be able to see castles, right? I mean, you see them on TV, you see them in the movies, you see them if you happen to ever toured Europe, or very few rare places in America and other places that where castle building really went on, but particularly Europe. And if you see them in the pictures or you see them in the show or something, it's very likely the darn thing's up on top of the highest hill around. And even if it's in the flattest country, you probably come breaking out of the woods, and there off in the distance is this huge formidable looking castle, big old walls. Well, you're actually in its first line of defense, which is that most castles wanted to be on a hill, or they would clear cut forest for hundreds, maybe even further of yards around it, so we can see the enemy coming. We don't want somebody to be able to sneak up on the darn thing, right? Even with all of our formidable defenses, we don't want the army to be able to get there and just immediately attack. We want to have some kind of heads up, right? And really, they may have had scouts and it's part of a kingdom, so there's probably even really a further line of defense, or at least an informational line. But just keeping to the castle right here, this immediate area was generally one of its first lines of defense. Then as you got closer, most castles, at least of lore, right, had a moat filled with burning oil or alligators or piranha or whatever, magic dragons, something, and then of course the drawbridge they could bring up. And then you've got your gate and your portcullis, you've got your intimidating walls with battlements and arrow slots and the ability to pour oil and throw stuff over the edge and shoot at your enemy. And even if the enemy breaks through that first wall, most major castles and implementations, there were layers of defenses, additional breaking walls. So like fire breaks in a way, so that if you broke in, they could fall back to the inner citadel and then all the way back to the actual, residence of the king or duke or whoever lived in that castle, and that final manor home would also be secure and be able to be locked down for defense, so that we can have these layered defenses before we get to what we were protecting. In a castle's case, we were protecting the royalty. In our case, we're protecting our corporate data. So we want to have a whole series of things, just like a military base would, just like a castle would. And it's one of the most important concepts, and you'll use it both from a corporate point of view as well as even tactically. When you start setting up, you might set up just a server and think, why do I have to think layered defenses? I'm part of this bigger layered defenses. Why not have layered defenses there if it's appropriate? And it's going to be in certain cases because of the value of that. If your company makes a gazillion dollars off the web, then you might not want to stop it defending the network and defending this. You want to have layers even on your web server of defenses and backup and things like that. So we some related concepts, and the last couple things I'll touch on here before wrapping up today, are the idea of, okay, so you've got layered defenses. You've broken things up in your organization, and don't worry if you don't know all the things. You should have some background coming in this program. So just throwing out the word firewall shouldn't confuse you, but when we talk about things like intrusion detection and firewalls and all these defenses and policies and things we can put in place to defend our network, and that we can break things up and defend them into these different areas, then we're putting in place that first policy of layered defenses. But then somebody's got to manage all this, and so as related to that, one of the things you don't want to do is build a very complex layered and structured defenses, break up all the roles within the defense team, and then keep everybody in those same roles. If Sally's always running your mail server and Bill's always running your web server, and neither one of them have the slightest inkling of possibly leaving or getting fired, and so they leave a backdoor or a logic bomb or some kind of code of malware out behind some kind of system so that they can break in and exploit or use this later, then that's bad. And if you've left, even though you've broken up everything. You got all these layered defenses. You've done everything else we teach you in our program. And then, you've let one person hold the keys to the castle, and that person takes advantage of you, then that's a weakness. So we would see a very common thing to do would be to have rotation of duties. You can even see that, in a sense that, say the guards at a military base, if it was always the same guard at the same time, and there are cases in history where stuff like this has happened, where, a guard has been bribed. And so if we always have the same guard at the same time, and then that guard can be compromised, then of course, maybe the enemy can slip in or attack at that point and have an advantage. And so if we have this one person always be the mail server admin, then that person could potentially be a weakness themselves, or because, they always do certain things a certain way, the attacker takes advantage of something they didn't do, right? So one of the things we don't want everybody to have, we don't want one admin to have everything, so we separate the roles. But then to make sure that one of them even then doesn't have all the keys to the castle, we generally have a situation of job rotation. And so combining these together, of course, we have that first layer of defense. We have a layered, or I shouldn't say first collection of defenses. We have layers of defenses. We have different types of devices, different types of people, all the way down to our users who have received training. And the idea is that we hopefully have built a better defense than just putting all of our eggs in one basket with, say, oh, we got the best firewall in the world, we're done. No, as we'll see and even learn examples of, having one piece of defense is not enough. We need to have this layered defense. But then the people who manage that, we need to look at them and make sure we're separating the roles so that we don't have one super administrator who has everything, because, even without maliciousness, if that user's account is compromised for some other reason, I've read cases of, and pen testers, we will get very creative in how we will get in, if that's what our job is, or if we're really, really targeting somebody. And that's what an attacker will do too. So the idea of, I have heard of companies being broken into because while they tried, the attackers tried to go directly, but those people had good security, they had good practices, they had knowledgeable people. But then, they attack the wife of a senior system admin, break into her machine, get access to the home network, steal information from the admin on his home network behind, inside of his network now, and then use that information, maybe access to private keys or things like that, to then be able to attack the system. So we have to think outside the box, and we want as many layers and as much rotation and division of duties and roles as we can, so that we minimize the possibility of an attack happening or the outcome of an attack when it does happen. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks, not only as we finish out this class next week with our last 6 lessons, and picking up with lesson 6, which is on further defense concepts, but as we go throughout the entire program, you'll be learning all aspects of cybersecurity. You'll be learning all the different techniques and skills and principles and concepts. You'll get to play hands-on with all kinds of cool virtual networks and virtual machines, attack and defend, and hopefully you'll enjoy the program. So once again, welcome. My name is Lee McWhorter. Connect with me on Slack. I'm just at Lee on Slack, or lee.mcwhorter@wazu-.com, waz-u.com. And of course, you can reach me in a number of different ways. All that's in the LMS announcements. When the rest of my lectures are done later today, I will get these all processed and uploaded and posted, and I'll update the LMS. If you have any questions, please let me know. Also pay attention to the LMS schedule. We have office hours, a Slack channel, all kinds of resources that we've gotten there, and people that can help you, myself included. And if you haven't already, I haven't had a chance to check email recently, but if my new students in this section, I reached out to them via email. And if you haven't yet, please respond back to me or reach out to me on Slack so we can set up a one-on-one schedule. And as I switch hats and put on my mentoring hat, so we can do your one-on-ones and keep you on track as you move through the program. Thanks. Have a good day.